let's see, this gentleman in the rear.
David Bannon at Bannon College. I wanted to ask what you thought of Steve Bannon and the recent things he said about Trump acting during his campaign in office.
They're surprising to me. I know Mr. Bannon. I have been publicly critical of him. In my things I have written and said, Mr. Bannon is what I call an enthusiast. He has no particular political experience. To my knowledge, he has never elected any man or woman to political office. I don't know about his level of sophistication in understanding polling and targeting, analytics, and the use of mass-based advertising. But when you are elevated to the highest possible office or the highest possible position of responsibility, you owe your discretion at a minimum and your loyalty to the person who was elected, because no one elected Mr. Bannon. Now, in Donald Trump's world, just calling yourself chief strategist is painting a target on your back, because in truth, the chief strategist of Donald Trump's campaign is Donald Trump. And the agenda on which he was elected, trade issues, immigration issues, economic issues, were determined a good year and a half before Mr. Bannon showed up with his bag. Nobody gave those to the president. If you went back and looked at the speech he gave in 1988, when I arranged for him to speak in New Hampshire, when I was pushing him to run for president the first time, he was talking about trade imbalances and the unfairness of our NATO partners not paying their fair share. He's been extraordinarily consistent in many of the thematic views that got him elected. So the idea that Mr. Bannon would be indiscreet, even if he held those views, the idea that he would talk to a reporter who had a reputation among many reporters, mainstream media reporters, as a fabricator, as someone who was fast and loose with the truth, well, I think you can chalk this up to hubris. I don't think he will be back as a force. The selection of Judge Moore in Alabama is something that I lay at his feet. A candidate who I would have had a hard time voting for after seeing his views and hearing his views. The initial round in Alabama had 4 candidates, not 2. And there was a better candidate whose views were more aligned with the president, but nobody apprised the president of that, and he thought he had to make a choice between Luther Strange, an epically corrupt incumbent who had been appointed to the Senate by the outgoing Republican governor who was on his way to jail, and a Congressman Mo Brooks, who'd been an outspoken critic of the president. He didn't even know that Judge Moore was running, although that's not where I think he should have gone. There was a 4th candidate, Dr. Randy Brinson, who was an entrepreneur, more of a libertarian Republican like myself, would have been a better choice. I think that Mr. Bannon should have weighed in. The other thing where I criticize Steve is that although he got into the Trump White House, he never helped anyone else who was for Donald Trump to get there. Not that I wanted a job. I had no interest in public service, having worked in the Nixon administration in the Office of Economic Opportunity. But when he was cornered, he complained that he had no allies. Well, he had not helped anybody else get there, and more precisely, he'd done nothing to stop those like General McMaster or Dina Powell or other neocons who, I guarantee you, did not vote for Donald Trump, don't share his worldview, don't share particularly his anti-interventionist, anti-war views, but Steve would lift a finger for no one else in the personnel process. Someone experienced in politics would understand that personnel. Yes, sir.
Donald Trump is quoted to say, Rogers is a stone-cold loser, he's always taking credit for things he never did. Now, we know that's not true. We do know he always feels the need to lash out when he feels insulted. Is that a good quality in a president?
President and I had a falling out over the question of Elliot Spitzer. You may be familiar with him. He was driven from office because he was essentially prosecuting men for patronizing prostitutes when he himself was patronizing prostitutes. As a libertarian, my argument is with his hypocrisy, not with the fact that I think prostitution should be legal. I didn't respond to any of that. That's why we were later able to reconcile. But again, as I've said, Mr. Trump wants it to be known, and he is correct, that he is the maker of his own image. He is the captain of his own ship. He is the strategist of his own strategy. He is his own press secretary. He is his own speechwriter. He is his own phrase maker. The political success here, as improbable as it is, his election, is due to his own will and his own vision. And in that, I do not argue. Yes.
My question is more about the fact he's very completely thin-skinned, and when he has boasts about the size of his nuclear weapon, is that, when the presidency has consequences, is that really a trait we want?
I don't think it's universal, meaning sometimes he is and sometimes he isn't. Look, he is what he is, and I'm not going to stand here and criticize him. But again, he's not, there's nothing inauthentic. This is the man, and he can have a hair-trigger temper. I will say this, though. It immediately recedes. He's not a grudge holder. He may erupt at you or someone, and then it passes. Which is why we were able to reconcile. It's why others will be able to do so. Perhaps even Mr. Bannon. Who knows? I don't think that he is. I don't think that he is intransient. I do think that he does not brook criticism well. That would be fair to say. Yes.
My name is Kristen. I'm from St. Catholic Society, and I would like to ask, you argued a lot about how this campaign was so different from other ones. It didn't employ the same traditional means of campaigning. Yet you've fallen back repeatedly on very traditional use of racism and sexism in this. You'll have to excuse my language in quoting you directly, but you did refer to Ana Navarro as an entitled diva bitch.
Yes.
You referred to Roland Martin as a stupid Negro.
For which I apologized in writing.
Negro. And you created an organization called Citizens United Not Timid.
Yes.
Which has an unfortunate acronym.
Yes. Well, I argue that it didn't, but go ahead.
That clearly is very anti-feminist in its nature. And you argue that censorship needs to be stopped in order to have free speech and in order to help democracy. But when you openly, and you did criticize the racist views of other people in this, and then you also criticize the hypocrisy of other people while you yourself perform it, isn't that why we need organizations like Twitter to ban you, and we need organizations like CNN to say, no, you can't call one of our commentators a bitch and then be invited back?
Except for I was. And the so-called ban, thank you, and the so-called ban at CNN has already been transcended, as has the so-called ban at MSNBC. I stand by my criticism of Ms. Navarro. Because you criticize a woman does not make you a misogynist. I apologized for my criticism of Mr. Martin in a column which I wrote for the Daily Caller. No, I'm not perfect. I also have made mistakes. But name-calling and this kind of question, which I assume was written by Media Matters for America, because it's right out of their dossier on me, which has me saying a number of things I never said, well, it's kind of contrived. Like Trump, I am what I am, and I have done what I've done. Yeah, I have a few two-martini tweets, and let he who is without sin cast the first stone. But by and large, I wreck the idea that if I get in a fight with someone who is a woman, that makes you a misogynist, or if you get in a fight with somebody who's black, that makes you a racist. It doesn't. Thanks. Yes, sir.
You are one of the most experienced or agents of the Republican media machine over the years. It's very well known from in between out the Beltway analysts or like us how afraid the establishment Democrats are of that machine. So what happens all the time is that there are issues that are total straight shooters for the Democrats. You take the recent government shutdown over DACA from the Democrats' point of view, very popular, but they cave on it anyway. Because all of the time, it's in the heads of the establishment Democrats that they were making a lot of noise. You know, Fox News, so they should be afraid of that. But and so they can, very effectively spin issues to the Republicans' favour. But that's never talked about. You never hear on Morning Joe or CNN how the Democrats never should have caved. The people are on the side of you. It's all sort of hollow threats from Paul Ryan and so forth. But it's happened all the time. It's a very, very effective strategy from the Republicans. But what I want to know is how often, it's not talked about in the mainstream media, but how often is it talked about that that's a great strategy and we should do that again this time and so forth by the establishment Republicans? So how often are Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and even people like, Bill O'Reilly when he was on Fox News and Trump himself going, great, we take this issue, we make a lot of noise, and we know that the Democrats will cave again.
Well, obviously I'm going to disagree with the fundamental premise of your issue. I actually find the bias on the other side, with the three major television networks plus CNN, and to some extent MSNBC, to the extent anyone's watching. I think the president made it pretty clear in his speech, there is very definitely a compromise to be made on DACA. I think he wants to do it. Well, that was the example you used. So I addressed it.
If you people in general, there are certainly many different issues where the country is, even just outside of specific polling, that's a good clear example of the day, there's plenty of issues that are strongly in the more liberal favour. I'm not saying this is a good, they would say the legislation, but I'm saying it's a very effective tactic. It's astounding that the Democrats cave all the time.
Such as the constant repetition of the fact that there's Russian collusion in the election, which doesn't exist?
Even before, let's go back, let's say,
Can you hurry this up just so we can get more questions?
No, we're doing fine. I'm just trying to understand your, I just don't see, I guess I don't see it as one-sided as you do, nor do I see it as Machiavellian. No, those guys don't sit in a room and say, this worked, let's do it again. I kind of see it from the exact opposite point of view. Sometimes I find it hard to believe that the media reports a narrative that I know to be false, and I see the Republicans as being weak-kneed. I left the Republican Party briefly over the nomination of Mitt Romney because he was such a twit. Because he was such a fraud that he believed in nothing that I could tell, or perhaps his views were identical to Barack Obama. I actually joined the Libertarians for a couple of years. So I guess I don't see it as one-sided as you do. Best answer I have. Yes, sir.
When you mentioned that African American and Hispanic unemployment was at an all-time low under Trump, do you not believe it's misinformation to credit him with this? Bearing in mind the rates have been falling at a rather consistent rate for the past few years, and in fact they've not changed at all in terms of the rate. It's declined during Trump's sort of rule, so to speak.
Well, first of all, I have some fundamental distrust of all the employment figures because, to a great degree, particularly during the last 8 years, I think they were cooked by taking people who'd stopped looking for work off the rolls and not counting them. You could make the statistics look better than they are. But based on everything I have read, the most recent statistics in those two particular cohorts are the lowest they've been since those began being tabulated. A rising tide lifts all boats. At the same time, the president, very clearly in his remarks, pledged to rebuild the city of Detroit. And in the campaign, he pledged a strategy for our urban areas, and that would mostly benefit our minority communities. I want to see it. Where is it? When is it happening? We've got 3 more years. But it cannot just be, in my opinion, campaign rhetoric. Yeah, I've worked for candidates like Jack Kemp, like Tom Kean of New Jersey, who've been civil rights advocates. I worked for the president who gave us affirmative action, which is a boogeyman on the right among my more conservative friends. So, but I don't think those statistics are inaccurate. I think they're accurate. They could be much better, but they could all be much better. Yes, sir.
Anyone who's been close to a story that's been written about can see the massive discrepancy between what actually happens and what's sort of published in the press. But what would your advice be to people reading sort of mainstream media or any media outlet to sort of identify some possible sort of discrepancies? Yeah.
Well, I'm a skeptic. I urge you to be a skeptic. I urge you to do your own net-based research and to look at alternatives to the mainstream media sites. Many conservatives like to criticize the New York Times. I find their coverage to be, incorrect in some place, incredibly, shockingly correct on other occasions. I think they provide a more reasonable balance than, say, the Washington Post. I do like to look at alternative sites for alternative information, and above all, make up your own mind. Don't let anybody tell you what to think. That's the best advice I can give. Yes, sir.
Freddie, hi, goes in college. I'd just like to ask, would you agree that accusations of racism against Trump and people like yourself shows that the left clearly haven't learned the lessons of what lost in the campaign in 2016?
Well, I don't think you're going to win on that charge. I do think that deeds are more important than words. I cited the economic statistics. I think they're moving in the right direction. I was interested to see, for example, the president has criticized those NFL football players who have declined to pledge the National Allegiance or sing the national anthem. But the NFL reached a $375 million settlement with those players who are suffering from brain injuries played in the game. Those players are overwhelmingly African American. Virtually none of those claims have been honored, nor have they been paid. Some of these families are on food stamps. Some of these players' families are barely getting by, they're destitute, and the claims administrator has made $70 million in fees, but the players aren't being paid because they're waiting for them to die. When they die, they don't have to be paid. To me, that is racist, that is wrong. That's what I'd like to see the president talking about. Yes, sir.
David Taslis, Nathan's College. This is a bit of a softball, I think. If Donald Trump hadn't run for the nomination in 2016, who do you think would have been the GOP nominee? Who do you think would be president today, and who would you have backed?
That's a difficult question. I think in retrospect, Donald Trump was probably the only candidate who could have beaten Hillary Clinton. I think all of the Republican candidates, all of the other Republican candidates would have lost. The irony, of course, is that Mitt Romney didn't want another go. President Nixon once told me that no person who comes this close to the presidency doesn't dream of another shot. But Romney didn't run because H.W.Bush was a sure thing. And of course that turned out to be wrong. In all honesty, had Trump not run, I would have supported Governor Gary Johnson and the Libertarian Party as I did in 2012 based on my opposition to war, my concern about the erosion of our civil liberties and government spying on us, my support for legalized marijuana. Those are things I would think have led me to one of the minor parties. So I guess I answered your question. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yasmin Hilby. Obviously, you've been instrumental to Trump's campaign in terms of him being elected or encouraging came to Brian in the first place. Would you say that you associate yourself with, and are you pleased with the fact that the American people elected someone who calls Muslims terrorists, Mexicans rapists, and is proud to grab women by the pussy?
I didn't put those words in his mouth. As I said, he is his own drummer. I don't subscribe to all of those views, although I do think unfettered illegal immigration is a very serious problem. I did think, as others did, that after the NBC comments that would doom his candidacy. I was somewhat surprised that he bounced back rather quickly and the whole narrative moved on. That told me that there was a deeper dissatisfaction. But at the same time, Bill Clinton's sexual assault of numerous women and Hillary's role in bullying and intimidating and silencing those women, as I document in my book, The Clinton's War on Women, as Christopher Hitchens documented in his book, as David Brock documented in his book, The Education of Hillary Rodham. I found those things offensive as well, and so did the American people. You had a question, didn't you? Yes. Yes.
So you alluded to similarities between Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. How far do you think anti-establishment parties in the rest of the West, so Europe, and particularly far right, how far do you reckon they'll rise and when do you think they'll peak? And a second question, really quickly. You talked about, you alluded as well towards the 9/11 families who existed by Saudi Arabia from Sweden going on 9/11. Donald Trump has got very close to the new Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. What do you think the likelihood is that he will succeed, and what do you think the implications will be if he doesn't succeed in changing the country?
At least in the United States, it's important to understand that the rules regarding ballot access and the rules regarding the debates and how one gets into the presidential debates are formulated by Republicans and Democrats working together. They don't want any competition. The Presidential Commission on Debates is not appointed by the president, is not a commission, is most certainly not about debate. It's about limiting debate. The criteria they use for minor party candidates is standing in the polls. Well, that's a chicken and egg situation in which you can't be in the debates unless you top 15%, and you can't get to 15% unless you can get into the debates and become better known. And then, when you actually hit their threshold, they hastily call a meeting and they move the threshold higher, as they did to Governor Johnson in 2012, as they did to Ross Perot in 2000, I guess it would have been, 2002, I guess. So there's an inherent disadvantage a structural disadvantage to minor party candidates. I make no bones about the fact that the nomination of Donald Trump is the hostile takeover of the Republican Party, snatching it back from the elitist establishment country club Republicans, the Bushes, who in my view had made it almost identical to the Democratic Party in terms of policies. And what the future manifestation of that it remains to be seen, whether this is a short-term phenomena or whether, as I believe, this populist movement, this anti-globalist or pro-sovereignty movement is larger than Trump himself, which I think is possible, likely in fact. Let's see. All the way there in the back. Well, I know Dr. Kissinger from my service in the Nixon days. I was very junior, obviously. The reason that Richard Nixon installed a taping system in the White House was because he feared that later, after his presidency, Henry Kissinger would take advantage, would take credit for what were Nixon's policy initiatives, the strategic arms limitation with the Soviets, the opening of the door to China, the end of the Vietnam War on a faster timetable than the Pentagon wanted. And of course, that was instrumental in bringing him down. Mr. Kissinger is a courtier. He is very temperamental. He threatened to quit every 15 minutes. But it's important to understand two things. It's Kissinger's pushing Nixon for the wiretapping of reporters and White House aides in 1969 that lays the groundwork for Watergate. And he walks away from that unscathed. It is Kissinger who now I think is playing a valuable role in terms of getting the assistance of the Chinese to cross-pressure the North Koreans to come to the table and try to avoid a confrontation. So I think in that case he's playing a constructive role. He's amazingly energetic for his age. He is much closer to the Chinese, I gather, than the Russians. I regard him with a certain level of suspicion because I do think he's emblematic of that same neocon, two-party, pro-war foreign policy establishment that I think Trump's election is the rejection of. Yes, sir.
I'm Forshaw, Great College. A large part of the President's of America's role is their interaction on the world stage and their diplomacy, and you could argue that's more relevant now than ever. Do you believe that Trump has the ability and the tact to actually successfully maneuver diplomatic relations from America's point in the modern world, or is that yet to be seen?
I do. Unlike others, I think his bellicose talk on North Korea is why the North Koreans and the South Koreans are at that table today. Ironically, I think it is the generals who are pushing for a confrontation, and Trump himself would like to defuse this, but he also recognizes that you have to use the carrot and the stick. I don't think Obama did himself any favors by declaring that there was a line in the sand and then doing nothing when our adversary stepped over it. So I do think that he is capable of deal making. That's what he does. He's not an ideologue. He is a pragmatist. He is probably, conservative-oriented populist. But he is, I think, capable of some grand compromises. There is a compromise on the table to be made on DACA. There is just no question about that. But he's not going to get nothing in return. He's made it clear that he wants to seal our southern border and he wants an end to chain immigration, or at least limitations on it. And I think he's prepared to let the dreamers stay. And we need a path to citizenship ultimately, but it is unfair to cheat those who have been waiting in line, who have been going through the system, and let those who are breaking the rules and the law move ahead of them. So I think he's capable of great compromises and great accomplishments, both internationally and domestically. Yes, sir.
Alex Bosker's College. You talked about civil liberties, freedom of speech, and you're fairly anti-censorship as well, as you just mentioned. But so, what do you think about the repeal of net neutrality then, and how does that work with the Trump administration?
I think it's very important to understand the old net neutrality rules. Net neutrality is only insisted upon for the providers, Verizon, AT&T, Comcast. There's no guarantee of net neutrality by content providers under the old rules. They can censor you, they can shadow ban you, they can retard your feed so it isn't seen. Those things should not be allowable. True net neutrality is legal access for everyone, but for the content providers, not just for the service providers. I wrote a long piece on this for the Daily Caller about 2 weeks ago. It's not an easy issue because both sides have tried to appropriate the same rhetoric, but I think the new rules actually will provide greater access to the market than for everybody than the old rules. Yes.
How many times Bannon College? So I appreciate and agree with you that debate is good for democracy. But how can we believe that Trump is meant to be good for democracy when he categorically shuts down debates with ignorance and unwillingness to learn? I point to the issue of climate change. Like, this year, New York has been the second coldest winter ever. And yet, he tweets that, oh wait, New York's pretty cold this year, we could do some warming up, and we could do with that climate change. Literally is not like willing to engage in this debate, which is one of the issues which is affecting us right now, like really problematically.
The campaign was the debate, and he was elected. He's not going to abandon his views. If the voters want to take that out on him in the 2018 election, they'll have the ability to do so, or in 2020. But he's not going to abandon his core beliefs. The debate is what the campaign is about. The campaign is a debate. It's what he thinks.
Right to reply?
Pardon me?
Right to reply?
Yes, go ahead.
So he has core beliefs, but if he's unwilling to listen to other people's evidence, how can you engage in meaningful debate and actually improve the world and his own country and save people from disasters, save Florida from flooding, and save hurricanes and so many more things that have happened in America?
I think his advisors have brought him a lot of evidence that is to the contrary to what he thinks. A number of them agree with you more than they do with me or with him. So it is not that he hasn't seen evidence to the contrary, but he does not believe it. It was this on which he was elected. Yes, sir.
Just from the other college. What are your personal views on climate change, given the demonstrable evidence that it's impacted?
I remain agnostic. I'm not certain, to be honest with you. I've kind of tried to read both sides, and I don't know. So, and it's not an issue that I ever spoke about or have written about or advocated that he use in the campaign. I do think the Paris Accords were not in our interest, but that was for economic reasons. Why should we pay and China pay nothing? They're one of the greatest polluters on the face of the earth. But the fundamental underlying science, I would say to you, I don't know. I'm uncertain. I'm unqualified to give you an opinion at this time. I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to take one more.
Okay, so this might be a damn script to end on, but you've talked about your time with President Nixon, with Mr. Trump. I was wondering if you could give us a brief overview, please, of your impressions and your time with Governor Reagan and H.W.Bush, please. And your impressions of them.
Yes. Well, of course, I worked for President Reagan longer than any of them through 3 presidential campaigns. There are a lot of similarities with Trump and a lot of differences. I recall when President Reagan was asked, do you think your background as an actor hurt your ability to be president? And he said, honestly, I don't see how a guy who hadn't been an actor could do this job. Reagan understood the importance of the aspects and the impression of leadership. He was very much a big picture man. He knew what he believed. He knew what he didn't believe. He was perfectly willing to leave the small details to others. He knew, for example, that he opposed federal tax increases, and he knew that the Soviet empire was evil, and that that the Soviets could not keep pace economically with continued arms buildup, which is ultimately what causes them to crash. This is a very different view than the Nixonian Kissinger view that we're just going to have to coexist at equal or maybe even diminished levels because the Soviets are going to move ahead of us. Reagan just never accepted that. He really believed that he could drive them economically to have to tear down the curtain, and of course, they did. On a personal level, though, he was extraordinarily detached. In other words, his personality in private was exactly the way it was in public. He was affable and friendly and easygoing and good-natured. He only yelled at me once that I can remember, but that's because I did something stupid. But he was genuine. There were no two Reagans. That's the way he was. He also, having come from an entertainment background, he understood the importance of exercise and diet and rest, and he paced himself very carefully because for him, it was all about the performance. He thought that was one of the most important aspects of leadership. Now, and he had very little interest in the nitty-gritty of politics. He may even have seen it as kind of grubby and it's something that never particularly interested him. Contrast that with Nixon, an extrovert in an introvert's business, someone who was uncomfortable with people, who had to force himself to make small talk, but who knew my wife's name, knew the name of my children, knew how many dogs I had, called me on my birthday every year from the time I went to work for him till the time of his death, who would send you handwritten notes when he saw you on TV and thought you'd done a good job. There was a personal dimension with Nixon that never existed with Reagan. If you were working for Reagan and one day you just didn't show up, he would never say, well, what happened to Roger? He would just deal with the new man, whoever that was. In the case of George H.W.Bush, that kind of goofy, good-natured, public persona, I think, hid a steely determination, a total lack of any philosophy or principle whatsoever, and a chameleon-like willingness to be whatever he needed to be. He ran for the U.S. Senate as an extreme right-winger. He ran for the House as a very liberal Republican. He championed Planned Parenthood and abortion in the House. He ran for president as an anti-abortion candidate. He was a crony capitalist who believed in nothing whatsoever other than winning. And I think that showed in his presidency. He had an enormous public goodwill based on his success in the war, but he never put forward a domestic program and used that political capital to help people, to rebuild the cities or expand the economy. And of course, lastly and most importantly, read my lips, no new taxes, a pledge that he immediately went out and broke. And that was functionally the end of Reaganism. I have written a book on this subject. It's called The Bush Crime Family. I commend it to you. Thank you very much.